I want to turn the conversation a little bit. Bob also was in the U.S. government at one point, so we're going to ask him about this as well. He's not now, obviously, and not part of the Obama administration, but there was quite a bit of recent press coverage about how the Obama administration, as an explicit policy, is trying to make available information communications technologies to various groups in countries around the world to use for the purposes of and it's expressed as in governments that are more repressive, but to make use of information communications technologies to self-organize, to communicate with others, and to send information, of course, outside and receive information. So this is an initiative where the U.S. government very explicitly is now saying we're going to provide, we're sanctioning. This has been going on now for a number of years. Well over 15 years. I just saw Robert Guerra come in. Aren't you in the room, Robert? Yeah, I didn't see you before, so I was going to mention your name. Robert Guerra has worked on this for a number of years. A guy named Patrick Ball, many years ago, under the auspices of the American Academy for the Advancement of Science, started a project, maybe 15 years ago, Robert, or even more, 10, to provide, to allow groups, for example, to encrypt their laptops so they could, just carry a laptop with information in it. And if it was seized by the police, they wouldn't be able to, access the information and find names of other people in the country, for example, very simple use who might be involved in this resistance group or this group that was opposed to the government. So these kinds of private efforts have been going on now for a number of years and have been quite active and have had varying degrees of success in different places at different times. It's kind of, a sine wave or different outcomes over time. But now the U.S. government is actually weighing in and putting a thumb down on the side of that and saying this is going to be part of our explicit policy. I'd like you to comment on that.
I hesitate to tread into these waters. Having been in the government and knowing how hard it is to make policy and talk about policy, it's hard to criticize people who actually are trying to get their jobs done. However, never being too shy, I would say that I think they were doing a good job until the New York Times article, or a better job. I think that it's too bad that this kind of stuff becomes public because it gives the clues to the other governments what to look for, and thus can be self-defeating. That may sound like a call against transparency, but I'm thinking of this from a U.S. government point of view as opposed to a Google point of view. If your intent is to make a change, is to arm people, as it was said by the last panelist, by Nasser, to weaponize in a certain way these things. There's a public way to do it and there's a private way to do it. And if I'm in government, I'm more in favor of the private way to do it. I think that we've seen some pretty ugly stuff over the last year when it comes to the State Department funds for circumvention technology, where the funds were essentially held hostage to the fact that one senator or congressman, I forget which it was, wanted money to go to a group that's essentially backed by and run by Falun Gong. Had I been in the government, I would not have gone ahead with that because giving money to Falun Gong, official U.S. money to a Falun Gong backed or a Falun Gong shadow group is like sticking a hot poker in the eye of the Chinese government. Not exactly the right way, if you are the U.S. government, again, thinking from their perspective, not exactly the right way to make progress if that is your ultimate goal, is to have ties that are at least workable between the two countries.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I was an early champion of what Robert was doing and others, and Pat Ball and so forth. But when I read that Times article, my reaction was more negative than positive, definitely. And I think for a couple of reasons. One is with the elements that you described, but also too, it's a very interesting intervention in the sovereignty of other nations. And so nation states like their sovereignty, and the U.S. likes its as well. And so if they're going to be doing it to other people, they're inviting it to be done back to them, and maybe in a different guise. Obviously, we don't need countries parachuting or dropping from planes computers for us, but in a different guise, and sort of this erosion of sovereignty from government to government. In addition, I thought immediately of all of our sorry ventures, arming the Mujahideen to fight the Soviets, and many, many other examples. What's going on in Iraq, Afghanistan now, where the very advances we give them to help achieve a certain policy aim at a certain time come back to bite us very hard. And so I also am concerned about that we are training people who, again, will turn around and perhaps come into power, but use the capacity that they will have that will be far in advance of the capacity of the rest of their population. So the asymmetry just becomes much more grave.
I think those are really smart observations on the the delicate balance that you have to strike here. It's not like I can stand up here and say, or sit up here and say, this is a bad goal, to try to, in some way, increase the access to information that people have. I don't think it is a bad goal. But I do think it has to be done with great, great delicacy. One thing I do want to say, as the representative of a U.S. company, is, and I'm not looking for any pity here, it is hard sometimes to operate as a U.S. company because certain governments view you as a tool of the government. And view whatever you do as being done hand in hand with government request, that you're either acting at the government's behest or you are partnering up with the government in private, and then they just assume that you have exactly the same goals. And we've, run into quite a number of troubles across the world with that assumption. So it's something we have to fight.
I'd call that a good problem, right? That's a problem of success.
It's
right?
a problem, but at the same time, companies, to a certain extent, have to keep their distance from the U.S. government. At the same time, we want to have relations with the government that are strong enough so that when something happens and we need intervention on our behalf, or some kind of help, or even just who do we talk to in the communications ministry, if it's a country we don't know well, we can call up the State Department or Commerce or whoever and say, hey, can you give us a hand?
This was meant to be a very brief conversation because we have to end soon. So I have one last question for you, Bob. The last question I have is, what is the one thing that could be done tomorrow? So it must be it can be done. It's actually capable of being done. Okay, it's not hypothetical. What is the one thing that could be done tomorrow using social media or information and communications technologies that you believe would most improve a people's rights of self-determination?
Well, I'm going to modify the end of the question, because we're not in the business of helping people determine their right to self-determination, if you'll excuse the double determine. If you ask me what is the one thing that could be done with technology or so forth to increase the chance that people have the chance to express themselves or access information, I would say and this can be done today, although it's not done right at the moment, I would say would be to develop a mobile device, a second-tier mobile device, and by that I mean not a smartphone, that can be used to access the internet and exchange information by people who use these devices throughout the developing world, including in countries that have repressive regimes. I think the future is all about what you hold in your hand. And if we're really serious about this question of the free flow of information, about giving people that strength that the tools they need to accomplish whatever their political goals might be, then we have to look towards the mobile device and create something for it that will give people greater security. Right now, people are, I would say, incredibly vulnerable when they use these devices, and that worries me a great deal.
Great, thank you very much. And please join me in thanking Bob for being a good sport, to being subjected to a series of questions at the end of the. So this is an initiative where the U.S. government very explicitly is now saying we're going to provide, we're sanctioning. This has been going on now for a number of years. Well over 15 years. I just saw Robert Garrett administration as an explicit policy is trying to make available information communications technologies to various groups in countries around the world to use for the purposes of. I want to turn the conversation a little bit. Bob also was in the U.S. government at one point, so we're going to ask him about this as well. He's not now, obviously, and not part of the Obama administration, but there was quite a bit of recent press coverage about how the Obama and it's expressed as in governments that are more repressive, but to make use of information communications technologies to self-organize, to communicate with others, and to send information, of course, outside and receive information. Come in. Aren't you in the room, Robert? Yeah, I didn't see you before, so I was going to mention your name. Robert Garrett has worked on this for a number of years. A guy named Patrick Ball, many years ago, under the auspices of the American Academy for the Advancement of Science, started a project, maybe, 15 years